I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Ika Danhover. Some of you may know her. She's an associate professor at the Institute of Agriculture and Forestry Economics at the University of Natural Resources and Applied Life Sciences in Vienna. And her research focuses on management and decision-making on family farms. And just to give a quick overview, I think that's exactly what she's going to talk to us today about, that the transformability aspect of resilience. To add something else, she's a member of the executive committee of the International Farming Systems Association, as well as a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Rural Studies. Yeah, thank you, Ika. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very honored to have been invited as a keynote speaker, as a social scientist, just before all these eminent ecologists. And I kind of feel a bit like the warm-up band before the big concerts. So here you go. I've been invited to talk, and I'm trying to put my background, which is social science, farmer decision-making, resilience of family farms, into the topic of today's talks, which is sort of the post-corona world and resilience thinking and what that can help us go forward. I will focus on the transformability aspect of resilience, which I believe has not received its due attention, let's put it this way. And maybe Corona can help us really move towards more transformative thinking. So resilience thinking, just a little primer for all of you, is fundamentally about learning to live with change. Change in the system itself, in the context, in the feedback, in the dynamics, all of that is very dynamic, and we tend to underestimate the dynamics. And I do think, and I will present that a bit later, that Corona gives us a great example and illustration about how dynamic and uncertain our world actually is. And the question then is, in resilience thinking, how does a system, in my case, it's usually farms, deal with all that ongoing change that is highly uncertain? Well, first of all, obviously, we can buffer things. Essentially, there's a drought. We don't do much. Right now, we have frost in Vienna, which is rather nasty because it's going to kill all the beautiful flowers we have, and we might not have an apricot harvest this year. Probably you just don't do much. You just persist and change and hope next year there won't be a frost at that time. You can also adapt. That's usually understood as incremental adjustments. So small adjustments, changes, but essentially you maintain the system, the system on the current pathway. And different to that and distinct from that is transformation, which is really about creating a fundamentally new system. And that's challenging because fundamentally new is usually something we do not know much about. And usually humans are not very keen on doing something entirely different they know nothing about. Well, this looks very different. Adaptation and transformation in practice is actually quite difficult to make a difference because adaptation, lots of adaptation can add up to being transformative. They can, but they don't have to. So they're still quite distinct. Now, the problem is that the transformation, that third strategy here, has been a bit sidelined. And the question is sort of why? Partly it's probably linked to the fact that resilient thinking started in ecology. And in ecology, transformation is usually seen as undesirable. So we don't really like atrophicated lakes. We think that that flipping is not a good idea. We'd rather have the clear state rather than the turbid one. There have been other studies about farmers extracting too much water and the problem that came with irrigation, and that can also flip and transform ecosystems. So generally, the idea has been to try to identify tipping points so they can be avoided, so we don't try to get there. Resilience root is thus in conservation ecology, which was the initial name of the journal. Now it's called Ecology and Society. So this is just an illustration that the aim is generally to preserve the ecosystem in the current state, or if possible, to improve it. If your humans have already degraded it somehow, to try to get it back to that system. So again, it's all that bouncing back issue. And there is very little emphasis on transformation. So conceptually, it's there. It's always mentioned in the definitions by various members of the Resilience Alliance, but it's not really something that's emphasized where there's a lot of work on. Social ecological systems is what we look at, and we understand them as deeply and intricately linked. And the dynamics are fundamentally driven by these interactions, by the interaction of the natural and social systems. They're still seen as distinct. So here we have an ecological system and a social system, which have their own little dynamics, and the ecosystem has its own little dynamics, and then they interact. So this is sort of how they've been conceptualized. And these dynamics tend to be fairly complex and adaptive, as in they change. Complex as in they're not really predictable. And as I mentioned, I'd like to use the current pandemic just as an illustration to understand what a CAS is, because sometimes it's a bit difficult for us to understand, because world usually before Corona seemed quite predictable by and large. We had a few larger crises, but essentially we kept on pretty much the same. One feature of a CAS is uncertainty and the unknown, and that's very different from risk. It's really that we just don't know. At the beginning, a year ago, none of us really understood how it would spread, what the incidence rates is, all this vocabulary that we learned lately, who is most affected, how that has changed. We used to have other groups in society, globally quite different. The vaccine development, initially it's like, oh, it takes years to develop a vaccine, actually was a lot faster. Then production was actually the problem. Maybe it wasn't entirely production, now distribution is a problem. There were quite a few surprises. There's a lockdown. I did hear about the lockdown in China in December and January, and I was sure this would never happen in Europe. There is just no way you're going to have a lockdown in Europe. Well, surprise, it does happen. I'm old enough to know that we used to have borders in Europe, and we used to have passport checks at the borders. And then came the EU, so Austria joined the EU in 1995. That's a long time ago. I never thought that we'd again see border controls within Europe. So this is just a good example of seeing how it can be very surprising, very fast, very radical. And it's also been seen as an example how all the national governments have been seen as not being able to do much because, globalization, we can't do anything. And suddenly the national governments remember that they can do actually quite a lot. This is just as a reminder that they can if they want to. The question is, when do they want to do something really radical? Currently, we have a lot of emergence, also a feature of a CAS, and that's variants. So now in Europe, we're battling the British variant, but then we have all sorts of mutations that come our way and immune escape, and we don't really know how these will interact with various vaccines. So that's going to be interesting. Children's mental health problems are a big issue. How about schooling? Something that we did not discuss a year ago. We have all sorts of anti-corona demonstration, also something we didn't quite expect coming. I mean, we are rational people, so things will be explained to us, and obviously we will do what is rational, which means do whatever the government tells us to do, because they have actually listened to scientists, right? Right. Also this sort of societal dynamic that we didn't see coming, and essentially none of us really knows where we're going to be in 2 months. We hope that with the vaccine things will get back to normal, but will it? And the long-term impact is something we've been discussing quite little, because the current depth that the governments are going into is going to massively limit what it can do afterwards. So again, this is just an illustration of what it is and how this is really a social ecological dynamic. Because the COVID virus itself is not the problem. The problem is how it interacts with our current society and the structure of our, structure and the processes and values that we have in our society. So imagine COVID-19 in the medieval times. Obviously, the impact would have been very, very different. And therefore, it's really the interaction between nature, in that case, the virus, and how a society is structured, and that is structured based on certain values that we have. We want to travel globally, and we can. We have a lot of mobility going on. We have urbanization, and the design of our cities makes a lot. We have growth-oriented economies that are very important, and therefore, we destroy forests. And the biodiversity loss definitely seems to contribute to these kind of pandemics that virologists tell us will become more frequent. And underneath all of that, there is also an assumption of rational choice. The model is called truth speaks to power. So a natural scientist, in that case, virologist, epidemiologist, essentially devise information and give that objective knowledge to policymakers, and they then make reasonable measurements and measures. And we now find out that that doesn't work that way, because actually there's a lot of interest groups that try to interfere with that, and how much governments can and will actually listen to scientists is diverse and open to interpretation. And there, so back to the science, we tend to have a lot of disciplinary sciences, and there is in that case very little integration of, for example, epidemiology, political sciences, and sociology, which would have allowed us to understand the whole dynamics a lot better, but currently we don't, because all of these disciplines are rather siloed. So back to our social ecological system, the question is, they're very dynamic, they're surprising, they can change radically in a short amount of time. We see that. Corona has shown us that. Now, the question for resilience thinking is, can we explore that beyond buffering and adaptation and use the principle of resilience thinking to really push towards a transformation? Because I would argue that business as usual is not really something we can go on. Nor do I think that a little adaptation, that is marginal changes, tweaking here and there, is going to be sufficient. The crisis that we as a society, as a global societies are facing is climate emergency. We produce plenty of food. How come we still have so many that go hungry? We have a biodiversity loss that is really problematic. We have poverty, income inequality, gender inequality, all problems that we know, that we have a lot of data on. Surprisingly little changes. So there's a lot of proposal by scientists how things could change, but very little changes. We have marginal changes, but they don't actually do much. The climate crisis is not really moved away since the Paris Agreement or since Kyoto. Really changes are marginal. And now the question is really, can we essentially go towards transformation? So really what we should do is work towards transforming the social system while maintaining the ecological system. And that is now very tricky, because we just saw that these kind of interact, and the question is, how do we conceptualize that? And it does ask us to think in radically new system, not just a bit of tinkering here and a bit more there and a bit less there. We've been trying that for decades. It has not made a big dent. So if we want a different post-corona world, radical change, transformative change is what we will really need. And that means new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of being. And that does include research, science, the whole research world, us. We are part of the social system. And I do think that each one of us, it is kind of helpful if we ask ourselves, how do we contribute to maintaining the status quo or to change it? And these are our practices as scientists every single day. What do we count as knowledge? Who or what do we include in our research? Who or what do we exclude? How do we communicate? To whom? All these are questions. And the question is, can we change them? Can we change our foundational assumptions? And that means transforming science, because I do not think that we can keep science the same and expect society to transform. And just we tell them how to do all different, but we do not change. I'm not so sure that more of the same is really going to do what we need if we are going to contribute to transforming our society. And here I'm just giving you an example that's one of several where we can say, okay, this is a group within the social sciences that's trying to really ask the hard questions about really thinking differently. It's called the ontological term, and I think it's understood a bit differently than in ecology, but essentially it's about questioning the fundamental assumptions of modernity. And that's everything that comes with 18th century Enlightenment, that's Europe here, and the Cartesian sciences, which are rationalistic, objectivist, mechanistic. So we can characterize them that way. There are other words we could use, but essentially you get the image. And essentially this ontological term questions all of this hierarchy, which are linked to the dualities, culture, nature, human, non-human, subject, object. These are strong differences that have been made by René Descartes, but all those that came afterwards. So there's us human and there's everything else. Many do believe that exactly this difference between nature and culture, between society and ecosystem, this conceptual difference that we make contributes to how our Western world deals with nature, which is rather exploitative. We also make a strong difference between reason and emotion, mind and body. And the question is, are we truly just cognition? Is our work really just intellectual? Because I'm rather passionate at what I do, and that's an emotion. And sometimes I feel something's off. There's something missing. There's something there. That is an intuition, and it is not rational. And what does that mean if we actually reclaim our humanness as researcher? And how do we define science versus belief? So everything we do according to Western norms of science is scientific, everything else is belief. Maybe there's other forms of knowledge that we should also acknowledge. It does not devalue what we do as scientists, but it means that we should integrate and see others as equally valid because they add certain aspects. And essentially, there is a work towards understanding the world in a non-dualist and relational way. And that has profound implications for us as scientists, because then these are not anymore two separate bubbles that then interact. They're deeply entangled. And essentially, it devalues everything that we tend to do, which is making the God trick. That's the disembodied gaze from outer space, where we see things in a non-emotional, objective way, which is usually what we see ourselves as scientists. Now, the question is, how creative are we to think this differently? Can we imagine ways to do research so as to actually contribute to society's transformation? And chances are we will need to transform science if we are to contribute to that transformation. And that is my last slide. Do we truly want to bounce back after COVID? I will argue, no. I would like to bounce forward different. Thank you very much.
I think, Ike, that also the auditorium would applaud if we would hear them. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I actually had already, we will have time for a few questions now. And if it's okay, I'm just gonna tell you the question. It was, I'm like the person said, I'm curious to see how opportunistic anti-globalists will be as pandemic has driven this fear.
How opportunistic?
How opportunistic
yes.
Anti-globalists?
There are many tendencies, and the question is, what can we do to essentially counter these strategies? Again, I am saying, I see many opportunistic, populist grouping here in Austria using it for their own good and against the global good. I think we have to be very careful. But the question is, what kind of science do we need to do? What kind of information? How do we interact with the public? If we actually want to contribute to saying we need a different world and a radically different world.
Thank you.